It always starts the same way. The ones who shout the loudest about tolerance, acceptance, and inclusivity are often the first to throw all of that out the window the second someone challenges their worldview. That's exactly what happened when Karoline Leavitt walked into that bank. Here you have a woman who's smart, accomplished, and poised, walking in expecting to be treated like any other customer. But instead, she's met with the cold shoulder, passive aggression, and a thinly veiled attitude that said everything before a single word was exchanged. The message was clear. We know who you are, and we don't like it. This isn't about poor customer service. Everyone knows what it feels like to be ignored or brushed off in a place of business. No, this was different. This was personal. The bank employee didn't have to say anything overtly political. The condescension was in the body language, the clipped tone, the fake politeness that barely masked contempt. Karoline wasn't just a customer. She was a target. Not because she was rude, not because she was difficult, but because she represents something they can't stand. A conservative woman who doesn't apologize for her views. It's funny how quickly all the liberal values fly out the door when someone like her walks in. These are the same people who put rainbow flags in their bio, attend equity seminars, and plaster their desks with slogans about kindness. But that kindness, that progressive spirit, it has conditions. It only applies if you're part of the club, if you toe the ideological line, if you're seen as safe. The second someone walks in who challenges that fragile bubble, even silently, they switch gears. Suddenly, it's okay to be dismissive. It's okay to treat someone like they're less than, simply because you assume they vote a certain way or hold beliefs that don't fit your script. What's even more telling is how smooth the shift is when they realize they've made a mistake. One minute, it's icy stares and short answers. The next, it's smiles, warmth, and over-the-top politeness. The kind of overcompensation that screams, "Oh no, I just embarrassed myself in front of someone important." That reaction? It doesn't come from principle. It doesn't come from some realization that maybe they were wrong to judge. It comes from fear. Fear that their little performance just backfired. Fear that treating someone like garbage based on assumptions might actually cost them something. And that's where the hypocrisy comes in. If the belief system you claim to live by can be tossed aside the second it's inconvenient, it's not a belief system. It's a costume, a performance. It's easy to preach kindness when you're surrounded by people who agree with you. It's easy to claim moral high ground when you never have to be tested. But when that test comes, when someone who thinks differently walks through the door, what do? In this case, the answer was clear. You judge, you sneer, and then you scramble to cover it up when it no longer serves you. The worst part is how normalized this has become. There's almost an expectation now that people with conservative values should just put up with this kind of treatment, as if they should walk into rooms knowing they'll be side-eyed, talked down to, or dismissed unless they prove their worth. It's a silent form of gatekeeping, and it's rampant in spaces that claim to be inclusive. The irony would be funny if it weren't so exhausting, because it's not just about one interaction in one bank. It's a pattern. A cultural norm being reinforced by people who refuse to see their own bias because they've convinced themselves they can't possibly have any. There was a time when professionalism meant leaving your personal opinions at the door. You served the customer in front of you with the same respect regardless of who they were or what bumper sticker might be on their car. That standard has eroded, replaced by performative politics and selective respect. People like Karoline don't ask for special treatment. They ask for the same basic courtesy that anyone else would receive. The fact that this has become too much to ask for in certain spaces says everything you need to know about where we are right now. Respect for some people is no longer earned through character, integrity, or the way you treat others. It's handed out based on perceived power. That truth revealed itself clearly in the way Karoline Leavitt was treated during what should have been a routine, uneventful visit. When she first walked in, she was met with indifference. That kind of blank, disinterested stare, the kind that makes it obvious you're being sized up and found lacking. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because of who they think you are. You can almost hear the inner monologue, "Not worth my energy." There's a certain arrogance that settles into places where people think they're the gatekeepers. It's not about customer service or professionalism or even common decency anymore. It's about ego. People begin to act like they're morally superior, as though their job grants them a pedestal from which to judge others. They decide who's worthy of respect not based on conduct or kindness, but on shallow assumptions and social signals. And in Karoline's case, the decision was made before a single word was spoken. But then, everything changed. The temperature in the room shifted like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, the same person who couldn't be bothered to look her in the eye was leaning forward, all friendly tones and eager helpfulness. The only difference? Status. That was the trigger. Not a revelation of her character, not an apology for the cold reception. Just the realization that she might be connected to something or someone perceived as influential. That was all it took to make her deserving of proper treatment. That moment lays bare the shallow foundation on which so many interactions now rest. There's no authenticity in that kind of behavior. It's not about principles. It's not about treating people with inherent dignity. It's about scrambling to cover up earlier rudeness when the calculation shifts, and it becomes socially or professionally risky to stay in condescension mode. People like this employee have built an entire worldview on the idea of equality and fairness, until of course fairness gets in the way of self-preservation. And that's the problem. Power is respected, not people. Character isn't enough anymore. Someone could walk in with a lifetime of service, grace, and quiet dignity and still be brushed aside if they don't signal status. Meanwhile, someone else could be arrogant and rude but still get the red carpet treatment because they're seen as important. That's the culture this kind of behavior feeds. One where the currency of worth is clout, not decency. This mindset isn't limited to banks or isolated encounters. It's part of a broader issue that infects every level of society. We've conditioned people to only show respect when they think there's something in it for them. You're not polite because it's right. You're polite because you're calculating. It's a transactional worldview, and it breeds environments where people like Karoline have to endure quiet humiliation right up until someone realizes she isn't just some regular person. That's the real insult. Not just the initial mistreatment, but the fake turnaround that follows. Because it's not born of realization or remorse. It's pure damage control. It's that panicked social reflex that kicks in when someone realizes their assumptions might cost them. But respect that only comes when there's something to gain isn't real respect. It's self-interest disguised in civility. And anyone, on the receiving end of that sudden shift, can see right through it. The sad truth is, people like Karoline are constantly being tested in these situations. They're placed under a microscope, expected to behave perfectly, even when they're being disrespected. They have to smile through the coldness, rise above the judgment, and stay calm even when it's clear they're being evaluated for something that has nothing to do with who they actually are. And when the script flips, when suddenly the person who dismissed them is now all sweetness and concern, it's almost more insulting than the initial disrespect. Because now they're being respected not as a person, but as a potential liability. If that's what respect has become, a knee-jerk reaction to power instead of a reflection of human dignity, then we've got the equation all wrong. It shouldn't take a title, a connection, or an implication of status to earn the same decency that should be offered to everyone. The fact that this is still up for debate says more about the person making the assumptions than it ever could. There's a kind of discrimination that's hard to prove because it's wrapped in politeness and hidden behind procedure. It's not loud, not obvious. But it's there, in the tone, in the timing, in the attitude that doesn't match the words. That's exactly what happened to Karoline Leavitt. When she walked into that bank, what she experienced wasn't just cold service, it was a deliberate distancing masked as professionalism. Everything about the interaction was laced with subtle judgment, and the most frustrating part is that the people who act this way always have a ready-made excuse. We're just following policy. That line has become a shield, a way to treat people unfairly while pretending it's not personal. Policy has become a convenient word to hide behind when someone doesn't want to admit they're treating someone differently because of who they are or what they stand for. It's plausible deniability with a smile. You can see it in the overly formal tone, the suspicious questions, the unnecessary delays. It's discrimination without the name tag. And for someone like Karoline, who's used to standing strong, in the face of opposition, it probably wasn't surprising, but it was still telling. This is the quiet bias that's become so common in certain environments. It's not about what someone says, it's about the assumptions they bring into the room. When you're conservative or even just perceived as being on the wrong side of a cultural line, you can feel it instantly. You're treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. The employee in that bank didn't need to make a scene. The message was already loud and clear. You don't belong here, you're not one of us. And yet, these same people will go out of their way to insist they treat everyone equally. They'll point to handbooks, guidelines, and company slogans to prove they're fair. But fairness isn't about what's written down. It's about how you act when no one's watching. It's about the subtle choices you make in everyday interactions. Who gets greeted with warmth? Who gets met with suspicion? Who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't? Those choices tell the real story, and in this case, the story was all too familiar. If Karoline had walked in wearing a certain activist slogan or dropping certain buzzwords, chances are the red carpet would have been rolled out. That's the irony. The very people who claim to hate discrimination often engage in it the most. Only their version is dressed up in performative empathy and selective respect. They've created a hierarchy of values where some voices deserve to be heard and others deserve to be dismissed. And when someone challenges that order, even silently, it threatens their sense of control. So instead of addressing the discomfort honestly, they hide behind fake professionalism. They go through the motions of service while withholding the human connection. That's what makes it so infuriating. It's not about denying someone a service outright, it's about denying them dignity in the process. About making them feel small, unwelcome, or less than without ever having to say the words out loud. What's even more frustrating is how immune these people are to their own hypocrisy. They'll swear up and down that they stand for inclusion and justice, but their actions show a different truth. They have no problem excluding those who don't fit their worldview. They see no contradiction in being rude to someone based on assumed political beliefs while preaching kindness and open-mindedness, because to them, some people just don't count. Some people are expendable. And in their mind, Karoline fell into that category the moment she walked through the door. The double standard is impossible to ignore. When their allies show up, it's hugs and warmth and thank you for your bravery. But when someone like Karoline arrives, it's cold protocol and vague suspicion. That's not equality, that's favoritism. And when called out, they retreat into their favorite defense. It's just policy. But everyone knows better. Policy doesn't explain why one customer is treated with respect and another with judgment. That's not about rules, that's about bias. Quiet, subtle, institutionalized bias that hides behind paperwork and a forced smile. And this is exactly how discrimination survives in modern institutions. Not through loud declarations, but through quiet exclusion, through selective enforcement, through the calculated use of tone and timing to send a message without ever having to say it out loud. It's a polished kind of prejudice, one that looks good on paper but feels rotten in person. And it's the kind that people like Karoline are expected to endure in silence while everyone else pretends nothing happened. In situations where disrespect is served before a word is even spoken, the natural reaction for most people would be to fire back, to defend themselves, to call out the double standard right then and there. But Karoline Leavitt didn't do that. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match the coldness with heat. She stood there, calm, composed, and steady. And in doing so, she did something far more powerful than clapping back. She exposed the pettiness and hypocrisy of the situation without needing to say a word. There's something remarkable about watching someone remain poised in the face of obvious disrespect. It flips the dynamic completely. The person who thought they had the upper hand is suddenly scrambling, trying to correct course, trying to overcompensate. That's exactly what happened. The person who started out acting as if Karoline didn't deserve basic courtesy quickly shifted into damage control mode once they realized their assumptions might have been off. The fake smiles came out. The tone softened. Suddenly, it was all about being helpful and attentive. But what really stood out wasn't the shift. It was Karoline's refusal to meet rudeness with rudeness. She could have said something sharp. She could have made a scene. She could have used her voice to call out what was happening in real time, and no one would have blamed her for it. After all, how many times do people like her get put in that position, judged not for who they are, but for what others think they represent? Still, she didn't take the bait. She didn't try to prove anything. She just stood in her own confidence, and that did more damage to the mask of professionalism than any confrontation ever could. That kind of restraint isn't weakness. It's strength. It's knowing who you are so well that someone else's misjudgment doesn't even rattle you. And it's rare. Especially in today's world, where outrage is the default and people are always ready to escalate. Choosing to stay grounded to let someone else's behavior speak for itself is a strategy that doesn't always get the credit it deserves. But in this case, it was exactly what revealed the truth. The awkward shift, the backpedaling, the sudden attempt at friendliness, it all said more than any accusation could have. What people often don't realize is that staying calm in a moment like that isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about keeping your own dignity intact. When someone treats you poorly, especially in a public space, the instinct is often to push back hard. But that reaction, while understandable, sometimes gives the other person something to twist, an excuse, a justification. Karoline didn't give them that. She left them standing there, fully exposed, forced to face their own behavior without any distraction. That's a powerful position to be in. There's also something to be said for how much more clearly people can see hypocrisy when it's not being drowned out by conflict. When someone keeps their cool, the contrast becomes undeniable. The shift, from dismissive to overly helpful, becomes glaringly obvious. The awkwardness in the room thickens because everyone knows what just happened, but no one wants to say it out loud. That's what happened here. Karoline's silence became a mirror, forcing the other person to see themselves without any filter, and judging by their sudden change in behavior, they didn't like what they saw. What makes this even more significant is the context in which it happened. Karoline isn't new to criticism. She's not unfamiliar with being misjudged or underestimated. But every time someone like her chooses grace over reaction, it disrupts the narrative, it breaks the stereotype. It sends a message that isn't loud, but it's clear. You don't get to define me with your assumptions. You don't get to reduce me to a caricature. And you certainly don't get to drag me down to your level. This kind of quiet resilience often gets overlooked because it doesn't go viral, it's not flashy, but it's the kind of strength that changes the energy in a room. It makes people stop and rethink. And maybe that's what's most unsettling to those who treat others based on assumptions. They expect a fight, and when they don't get one, they're left alone with their own discomfort. That silence becomes deafening, and in that silence, the truth about their behavior becomes undeniable. Karoline didn't need to prove anything. Her calm response proved it all. At the end of it all, what happened in that quiet little exchange inside the bank tells a much bigger story than just one awkward interaction. It reflects a cultural moment, a deeper issue about who we choose to respect, how we judge others, and what our values actually look like when they're put to the test. It's easy to say all the right things about fairness, kindness, and equality, but it's in the small moments, the subtle choices, the body language and tone of voice where the truth comes out. And in this case, that truth was loud and clear. Karoline Leavitt walked into that space expecting nothing more than common courtesy. What she got instead was a split-second judgment based on who she was presumed to be. And when the social calculation changed, so did the treatment. That flip, from dismissive to deferential, wasn't about integrity. It was about saving face. It revealed how transactional some people's values really are. They'll talk about empathy all day, but only extend it to those who fit neatly within their bubble. Step outside of that and suddenly you're not worth their time, unless they think you have power. What's remarkable isn't just how Karoline was treated, it's how she responded. She didn't match rudeness with outrage. She didn't expose the hypocrisy by calling it out on the spot. She let it reveal itself. That kind of control, that quiet confidence, speaks volumes. It doesn't just maintain dignity, it demands reflection. The employee who made those assumptions likely walked away thinking twice. And that's sometimes the most effective kind of lesson. The one someone has to sit with later when the performance is over and the room is quiet. This story also highlights something a lot of people are feeling right now, but don't always say out loud. The rules of engagement have changed. It's no longer enough to be polite or decent. You have to pass a certain ideological test to be treated with basic respect in some circles. And if you fail that test, even if you're respectful, composed, and professional, you're treated like a problem. That's not progress. That's just a new form of exclusion dressed up in different language. But stories like this also serve as reminders. They remind us that real strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from knowing who you are, even when others try to put you in a box. It comes from staying grounded when others are spiraling. And it comes from refusing to play the game of shallow validation. Karoline didn't need to win an argument. She just had to be herself. And in doing so, she revealed the cracks in a system that pretends to be fair while quietly enforcing its own biases. In a world full of snap judgments and performative values, there's something incredibly powerful about remaining steady, calm, and true to who you are. Because when the noise fades and the moment passes, it's that kind of quiet integrity that